Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place, and today I'll be talking about Byte Barrel's Forgive Me Father, a boomer shooter that harkens to the horrors of Lovecraft. But does that mean it was able to offer me a scintillating mix of anxiety and adrenaline, or was this deep dive into darkness doomed from the start? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. It started with a simple letter. The words were urgent but vague. Your cousin needed help for you to come to Pestisville. And so, you got on the train and made haste to meet him. But, when you finally arrived at the inn, there was no one there to meet you. Your only clues came in the form of scattered notes, curious trinkets, and the signs of a struggle. It's not long before any semblance of sanity begins to grow distant, as dreadfully deformed denizens begin to make themselves known, hinting at the terrible things taking place. It's all you can do to piece together the clues as the body count builds. Perhaps the solution might help you find some semblance of salvation for you and your cousin, if these secrets don't damn you both. Honestly, it's a decent premise, and one that's told to you in a few ways. Initially, the game draws you in with a moody cutscene and a bit of dramatic narration, setting the scene for when you finally take control. It's not a bad start, and there's even more to discover, as scattered throughout each stage is a number of interactable lore points, which provide flavor, clarification about the story at large, and even offer the protagonist opportunities to talk. Because, well, they are rather chatty, commenting on the things that you find, as well as the enemies that you're fighting, but we'll get to that. And I do say they, because you actually have a pair of protagonists to pick from. Admittedly, of my two playthroughs, I preferred the priest, as they had a grimmer tone to their spoken line.
Dormant evil wakes up at night.
Something which is very much in stark contrast to the journalist, who just gives off some glib, homicidally happy overtones.
That's a great story, but it's not my thing.
In essence, they feel like a bit of a walking genre shift, nudging the game's ambience a bit further into the action genre than it otherwise might have felt like. Something which felt especially notable given that, while the characters have different flavored dialogue, the cutscenes which punctuate each chapter are shared between them and try their best to retain that sense of ominous gloom and dread trepidation. An ambience that even extends to Forgive Me Father's gameplay. And this is admittedly a bit of a feat, given that it is a boomer shooter, a subgenre of SPS that frequently eschews the intrinsic tension that comes with the act of reloading, and does in this case. And yet, despite this, it still manages to pack a certain degree of uncanniness into the game design. One of the first and foremost examples I can think of is actually the enemies that you encounter. Not so much their grotesque appearances, though there is that, but in their behavior. There's something altogether disconcerting about ventilating a zombie's head, only for that shambling corpse to pause in its step, swap in the decapitated remains it had been holding, and then return to hunting you. Or bisecting a ranged enemy and watching its crippled top half pull itself across the ground towards your position, its advance possibly hidden by the scattered corpses of its peers. Instead of relying on jump scares that might lose their punch in a future replay, Forgive Me Father aims to make the entirety of its bestiary a ghoulish horror show, whose uncanny behaviors also tie into the challenge that each character brings to their respective biomes, to the squad arrangements that you come across. Something which is made more apparent by the consistent care put into the overarching level design. Each of the game's chapters consist of a solid series of diverse stages to travel through, and it honestly feels great to navigate through the various levels because they each have a different vibe to them, whether it's weaving through the claustrophobic corridors of a ship and tentatively trying to see if there's something waiting for you, to a desperate dash through cultist-infested woods, or the requisite sewer level. Hell, there's a great moment where you are on a farm wading through corn, unable to see above it and hearing things nearby. I had a lot of fun with these stages because all of them carry their own distinct challenges, deadly arrangement of enemies, and delightfully hidden secrets. They managed to capture this sense of uniqueness to the point where I would be hard-pressed to find the distinct challenge one stage overlapping too much with another, and them bringing their own deadly arrangements of enemies and delightfully hidden secrets that often left me scouring the stage to the best of my ability just to find them. And here's the thing, even with each of these stages feeling so different, they flow nicely from one to the other. It feels like a cohesive journey, and one which manages to balance the faster action segments with the occasional lull in combat to build tension or mood. Which, yeah, let's get into combat, because at the end of the day, while there is spooky things here, the basic staples of boomer shooter are definitely at play, with the gradual discovery of an arsenal of weapons to mow down the literal armies of enemies you're coming across. Admittedly, all of the weapons actually feel fairly useful here, though I did often find myself favoring some depending on what I was fighting and just what I was most comfortable with or had ammo for. That said, there's a few elements that serve to shake things up. First off, there's madness, which racks up as you shred through your enemies, ramping up the damage you deal and reducing the damage you take. It also sort of messes with the visuals and causing them to gradually become a bit monochrome, but more on that later. The other important element about madness, though, is that it serves to charge up your madness powers, which is the major mechanical difference between the priest and the journalist, since they share weapons. In the priest's case, he gets abilities like limited invulnerability, a helpful heal over time, a holy water loogie that paralyzes enemies, and a quick psalm to God for infinite ammo. Honestly, that sounds about right for what I know about North American religion. That said, where the priest is defensive utility, the journalist is, well, her kit reflects her flippant sociopathy. Just toking to slow time in the middle of a cultist fight, a voodoo doll that gives everything nearby, a camera that does the same thing as the priest's sacred spittle, and lastly, a big fucking sword that lets her rampage around taking reduced damage and heal by murdering people. It's definitely a little bit action hero. Still, both of these playstyles have their own strategic considerations, given these all have max charges and filling them up can take a bit of time, so knowing when to use certain abilities is a major tactical element to be mindful of. And that's not even the crux of it, because there's also a leveling system. That's right, as you're mowing down enemies, you'll be slowly making progress toward gaining skill points to flesh out the game's surprisingly diverse skill tree. At first, the options might seem a bit skint, as the tree branches out from the weapons and madness powers you've acquired. Also, if you're like me and invested in the extra experience option, you're also not going to be doing much with those points at first. That said, once you get past that part, there's interesting options to choose between, even early on, given skill points placed in the weapon trees will actually change your arsenal, often through mutually exclusive paths which will have you balancing survivability against utility or damage. For instance, sure, having a throwing knife as a infinite ammo default weapon is great for those days where you're out of ammo, but instead you could just double down on stabbing things extra hard and get some extra health to boot. What's more, even with the upgrades being mutually exclusive, you still won't have enough points to max out everything, and I tried emptying out stage after stage with all of the bonus experience that I could muster. That said, you'll still have enough to be able to meaningfully tailor your powers and arsenal to your liking, which is made even nicer by the simple fact that the game actually has a skill reset option built in. While it's initially limited to one at first, you gain an additional one each time you conquer one of the game's chapter bosses, providing you a pretty nice safety net to go and dabble around if you find yourself not jiving with a given route. Which, helps if instead of having a normal shotgun, you'd like to have a shotgun that ricochets bullets off of people you shoot. The low price of horrible demonic infestation. Though, you also have the option of just holding on to these points until you reach your local save spot, see the surprisingly happy homeless drunk on screen, and then just tinker around from there, because yeah, Forgive Me Father uses save spots, so you don't have to worry about a checkpoint updating and leaving you in a terrible spot, especially since you can't actually save while enemies are near. That said, there are some moments later in the game where this is a mild pain. Sure, It's pretty good to be able to reload and exploit skill point things to see what exactly everything does and whether or not you hate it. That said, I may have encountered some mild little dilemmas of multiple or prolonged jumping puzzles that will kill you instantly with a bit of space till the next save spot, and I swear, I actually died more to gravity than the game's boss gallery in totality. Every single one of them combined did not kill me as much as just a jumping puzzle. Like, the bosses aren't slouches either. Like, yes, I was playing as the priest, so I could cheese through some of it, which helped, given the bosses are legitimately tricky enough that you need some time to learn the ins and outs of their mechanics. But gravity remains the most deadly boss of all. Overconfidence, though, might be a close second because I tried the game's endless arena mode just to try playing out as the journalist, and found myself getting smeared into pace, something which had me sidling over to the New Game Plus mode instead, because honestly this offers some fairly interesting options. It's pretty great since it enables you to tweak so many facets of the game, such as the enemy's health, their outgoing damage, the starting skill points you have in case you want to try out everything, lets you start with those new weapons, and even has an Iron Man option as far as I recall, just to better fine-tune the suffering. It's really neat for doing a victory lap of the game. Really also just lets you take in the sights, of which there are many, because like I said, there's a fair bit of attention to detail in the game. It's legitimately fun to progress through the areas because of all the effort placed into making them feel like an actual journey. Though it can get a little bit disconcerting as the madness meter mounts and the game's color seeps away into horrendous monochromes. I'm blind as a bat at the best of times, and that can get a bit tricky for me catching some of the finer details in a firefight. Though speaking of fine details, I didn't miss the way the weapons themselves changed appearance as you went through their upgrade trees. It definitely made it feel a bit more rewarding. See, that whole thing about letting my shotgun become infested with an otherworldly creature. As a whole, I'd have to say I'm actually just fond of the visuals in Forgive Me, Father, and I definitely appreciated just how neatly they meshed with that comic book-esque cutscene style that intersperses the experience. And while I've already gone into my quibblings with the voice acting of the priest versus the journalist, there is a fine detail that I failed to mention. That's the fact that the soundtrack is excellent. You'll have heaps of great tunes to cap cultists and eviscerate eldritch creatures too. And I mean, I guess if it does need saying, while the flippant sociopathy is a little bit of a headache to me, I really enjoyed the priest's voice acting as I went through the game. But yeah, this brings us to the end, and I had a lot of fun with this, both for just writing this review and diving into this game. And overall, I really dug this experience as someone who doesn't even play that many FPSs or boomer shooters. On the whole, I didn't really mind the story it had to tell, and I appreciated the bits of environmental lore I encountered along the way. Between that and the world and the enemy design, it really helped to keep me invested with where the whole story was going. Honestly, the only thing that sort of grated to me was the ending. It felt a touch jarring, and yet, as the game progressed, I did recognize that there were a few moments where I was foreshadowed. Still, I found it a bit odd that the priest and journalist paths culminated in the same outcome. And gameplay-wise, I was in good hands. Enough so that I actually dipped back in for a bit of New Game Plus nonsense. I had a lot of fun gradually tweaking my arsenal and scouring the levels for the animations and assets I needed to conquer each stage. It was a great time, and the fact that I never quite knew what to expect insofar as the stage design or layout was a serious plus, which is made even more impressive when I take into account how lengthy the game feels. There's just a lot of content there, and that's why I have to say that at the end of the game, I can call this a solid hit, and something I'd recommend to people even if they weren't necessarily the normal audience for a game like this. It's a well-designed title and one that's pretty accessible given its difficulty settings. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. I'd honestly love to know if this game had any of you going, yes, daddy. Anyways, if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell to show there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and to my Patreon, so you can support me and Hop. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlyeon. That said, I'll catch y'all on the next episode, folks. Take care till then.